I'm Elena Volkov, 64, and for 38 years I've carried the weight of my husband Viktor's death at Chernobyl. Last week, his surviving cleanup team members called me delusional when I finally revealed what Viktor whispered to me on his deathbed. That could expose a cover-up that goes deeper than anyone imagined. They laughed at the crazy widow, not knowing I've spent 4 decades collecting evidence that proves Viktor and 12 other men didn't die from radiation poisoning. What I discovered about their real cause of death will shatter everything the world believes about that April night in 1986. Hidden in my jewelry box for all these years is a crumpled piece of paper with Viktor's final words about the real truth, words that powerful people have killed to keep buried. If you've ever been dismissed for speaking an inconvenient truth, hit that like button and stay with me, because some secrets are worth a lifetime of being called crazy. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was tending to my small garden behind our old apartment in Kiev. I almost didn't answer these days. Most calls were either scams or condolences from people who'd just learned about Viktor's death decades too late. But something made me pick up on the fourth ring. Elena Volkov. The voice was rough, weathered by years of cigarettes and vodka. I recognized it immediately, though I hadn't heard it in 38 years. Dmitry Petrov. I said his name like a curse, because that's what it had become in our household. Viktor's former team leader, the man who'd promised to look after me after Viktor died, then disappeared the moment the state funeral ended. I heard you've been ... talking about things that should stay buried with the dead. My hand tightened on the phone. Someone had told him about my conversation with Anna Kozlova, one of the other widows. We'd met at the market last month, and, for the first time in decades, I'd mentioned Viktor's final words. Anna's husband Pavel had said something similar before he died, something about finding things they weren't supposed to find. Viktor told me the truth before he died. Dmitry, about what you really found down there. The silence stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. Then came his bitter laugh. You always were too smart for your own good, Elena. Viktor said that about you. Said it would get you in trouble someday. Is that a threat? It's advice. From someone who's managed to build a decent life on the foundation of being a Chernobyl hero. You know how many interviews I've given, how many documentaries I've appeared in, how many young engineers look up to me because of my sacrifice at Reactor 4. I could picture him in his expensive Moscow apartment, the one he'd bought with money from book deals and speaking engagements. All of Viktor's surviving team members had done well for themselves, capitalizing on their status as heroes who'd helped contain the worst nuclear disaster in history. All except Viktor, who'd died keeping their secret. What about the others, Dmitry? Are they all living comfortable lives too? The ones who are still alive? Yes. And they'd like to keep it that way. We all would. The formal invitation arrived 3 days later, not for me, but addressed to my neighbor by mistake. Or maybe not a mistake at all. Maybe Dmitry wanted me to see it. The heavy cardstock bore the seal of the Veterans of Nuclear Disasters Association, announcing the 38th anniversary memorial gathering for the Chernobyl cleanup crew, honoring our fallen heroes. It read, a private ceremony for surviving members and their families. Viktor's name was listed among the deceased, along with the other 12 men who'd died in the weeks following the reactor explosion. But my name was nowhere to be found among the invited family members. After 38 years, I was still being excluded from their official narrative. That night, I pulled out the wooden jewelry box that had belonged to Viktor's mother. Hidden beneath the velvet lining was the crumpled piece of paper I'd treasured and feared in equal measure for nearly 4 decades. Viktor's handwriting, shaky from his final illness, but still legible. Elenot radiation. Found something. Below. They know. Promise. If anything happens, tell the truth, the real truth. Look for Project Prometheus. Trust no one who was there. Love you always. Vault. I'd read those words thousands of times, but only now did I understand what Viktor had been trying to tell me. His team wasn't just cleaning up a reactor explosion. They'd found something else entirely. Something that powerful people needed to keep buried beneath the rubble of Chernobyl. And now Dmitry knew that I knew. I was 26 when Viktor died, 3 months pregnant with our first child, and naive enough to believe that truth and justice were the same thing. The Soviet Union in 1986 was a place where asking the wrong questions could make you disappear. But grief has a way of making you brave in the most dangerous moments. Viktor had been acting strangely for weeks before the reactor explosion. He'd always been methodical, careful, the kind of nuclear engineer who checked his calculations 3 times and never cut corners. But in those final weeks of March 1986, he became secretive in ways that frightened me. He started coming home at odd hours, sometimes not until dawn, smelling of earth and metal and something else I couldn't identify. When I asked about his work, he'd just kiss my forehead and say, "The less you know, the safer you are, my love." Our small apartment began filling with visitors during those weeks. Other men from his engineering team, speaking in hushed voices, around our kitchen table. I recognized most of them: Dmitry Petrov, Pavel Kozlov, Mikhail Orlov, and 9 others whose faces I'd later see at too many funerals. They'd arrive after midnight and leave before sunrise, always carrying small metal cases that clicked like Geiger counters. Viktor started hiding things too. I'd catch him in our basement, tucking equipment behind the old water heater, or wrapping papers in plastic and sealing them in mason jars. When I asked what he was doing, he'd get that haunted look in his eyes. "Elena, if something happens to me, don't let them tell you it was just the reactor. Promise me that. There's more to this than anyone knows. Nothing's going to happen to you," I'd tell him, rubbing my growing belly. "You're going to be a father in 6 months." But Viktor knew something I didn't. The night before he left for what would be his final shift at Chernobyl, he sat on the edge of our bed and watched me sleep. I wasn't really sleeping. Pregnancy insomnia had me tossing and turning, but I kept my eyes closed because I could feel his fear like a physical presence in the room. "I love you more than my own life," he whispered to my pretend sleeping form. "If they try to tell you I died a hero, don't believe them. Heroes don't die for lies." The explosion happened on April 26th. Viktor didn't come home that night, or the next, or the one after that. The official word was that he and his team were working around the clock to contain the disaster, sleeping in shifts at the plant. But Anna Kozlova told me her husband Pavel had called from a payphone in Pripyat, whispering that they'd found something that changed everything. That was the last anyone heard from any of them. When Viktor finally came home 18 days later, he was dying, not from radiation sickness. I know what that looks like, and this wasn't it. His skin wasn't burned or peeling. He wasn't losing his hair or vomiting blood. Instead, he looked hollow, like something had been carved out of him from the inside. The doctors said acute radiation exposure. But Viktor's personal dosimeter, the one I found hidden behind our water heater weeks later, told a different story. The readings were high, yes, but not nearly high enough to kill a healthy 30-year-old man in less than 3 weeks. In his final moments, delirious with fever, Viktor gripped my hand with surprising strength. "Below," he whispered. "We found it below. They made us swear. But Elena, people need to know. Project Prometheus, it's not what they say. Not what anyone says." He died that night, and I lost our baby 3 days later. The doctors said it was stress, but I've always wondered if it was something else. Something connected to whatever Viktor had been exposed to in those underground spaces beneath reactor 4. The state funeral was elaborate, honoring Viktor and his 12 teammates as heroes of the Soviet Union. Dmitry gave a speech about their sacrifice, about how they'd knowingly exposed themselves to lethal radiation to prevent an even greater catastrophe. The families received medals and pensions and the eternal gratitude of the motherland. But when I tried to ask questions about the timeline, about why healthy men had died so quickly, about what Viktor meant by below, I was told that grief was making me irrational. The other widows were given the same message: honor your husbands, sacrifice by not dishonoring their memory with conspiracy theories. So I stopped asking questions publicly, but I never stopped looking for answers. After 38 years of silence, Dmitry's phone call changed everything. That night, I descended into our basement for the first time in months, armed with a flashlight and a determination I hadn't felt since I was 26 years old. Basement of our old Soviet apartment building was a maze of storage rooms and utility spaces, most of them forgotten by landlords and tenants alike. Viktor's hiding places had remained undisturbed all these years, protected by my careful maintenance and the general reluctance of people to venture into dark, cramped spaces that smelled of old concrete and rust. Behind the water heater, wrapped in oiled cloth, I found Viktor's personal dosimeter, exactly where I'd left it decades ago. The device was primitive by today's standards, but it still worked. I pressed the activation button, and the needle jumped to life. clicking rapidly in the presence of residual radiation from the metal casing itself. But it was the recorded readings that made my hands shake. Viktor's dosimeter showed exposure levels that were significant but not fatal, certainly not enough to kill a healthy man in 18 days. I'd seen the readings before, but now I understood their significance. If Viktor and his team had died from radiation exposure, their dosimeters should have shown readings 10 times higher, deeper in the basement, sealed in mason jars and hidden behind loose bricks. I found Viktor's journal. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but his careful engineer's handwriting was still legible. I carried the journal upstairs and spread it across our kitchen table, the same table where Viktor's teammates had held their midnight meetings. The early entries were routine shift schedules, equipment checks, radiation readings from around the plant. But as I read deeper, Viktor's tone changed. 3 weeks before the explosion, he wrote, "Something's wrong with the ground-penetrating radar. We're getting readings from spaces that shouldn't exist. Dmitry says it's equipment malfunction, but I've run diagnostics 3 times. There are chambers beneath Reactor 4 that aren't on any blueprint I've seen." A week later, Pavel confirmed the anomalous readings. "We've requested permission to investigate, but Moscow keeps denying access. Dmitry is nervous. He keeps saying we should focus on our assigned tasks, but how can we ignore structural anomalies directly beneath an active reactor?" 2 days before the explosion, we went down anyway. Dmitry was furious, but Mikhail brought bolt cutters and we accessed the lower levels through the maintenance tunnels. What we found, I don't know how to describe it. The chambers are real, and they're not empty. There are laboratories down there, equipment that looks decades old, and specimens. God help us, there are specimens. The final entry, dated the day before the reactor explosion, made my blood run cold. Project Prometheus is real. The reactor was built on top of something that was already here. We've been working above a research facility that officially doesn't exist. The specimens we found, they're not natural. Someone has been conducting experiments down there since the 1950s, maybe earlier. Dmitry says we have to report this, but I don't think he understands what we're dealing with. The radiation levels in those chambers aren't from the reactor. They're from something else entirely. I flipped through the remaining pages, but they were blank. Viktor had stopped writing after that discovery, probably because he knew he was being watched. But tucked between the final pages was something that made my heart race: a hand-drawn map of the underground facility. The map showed a complex network of tunnels and chambers spreading out beneath the entire Chernobyl complex, like the roots of some enormous tree. At the center, directly below Reactor 4, was a large chamber marked with a symbol I didn't recognize and a single word: Genesis. Viktor's handwriting around the margins noted structural details and radiation readings, but also something else: locations where the facility had been breached or damaged. Several chambers were marked with containment failure, and dates from the 1970s and early 1980s. My hands trembled as I studied the map. If Viktor was right, if this underground facility had been experiencing containment failures for years, then the reactor explosion might not have been an accident at all. It might have been a desperate attempt to sterilize whatever was leaking from the chambers below. I photographed every page of the journal with my phone, uploaded the images to multiple cloud storage accounts, and printed copies on my ancient inkjet printer. If something happened to me, if I disappeared, like Viktor's team had tried to disappear the truth, at least the evidence would survive. But as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The basement windows were too high and too small for anyone to see through, but I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. Dmitry's warning echoed in my mind: the ones who are still alive would like to keep it that way. I was no longer just a grieving widow clinging to conspiracy theories. I was a woman with evidence of a cover-up that reached back decades before Chernobyl. Evidence that suggested the world's worst nuclear disaster might have been a deliberate act to hide something even worse. And somewhere in Moscow, Dmitry Petrov and his surviving teammates knew exactly what I'd found. Armed with Viktor's evidence, I realized I couldn't face this alone. If my husband's journal was accurate, then 12 other men had died keeping the same secret, which meant 12 other widows might have pieces of the same puzzle. Finding them wasn't easy. After the Soviet Union collapsed, people scattered across newly independent republics, chasing work and new lives. But grief has a way of binding people together. And the Chernobyl widows had maintained a loose network over the decades: Christmas cards, occasional phone calls, shared memories of men who'd died too young. I started with Anna Kozlova, Pavel's widow, the woman I'd spoken to at the market. She lived alone, in a small apartment across town, surviving on a modest pension and the occasional help from her grown children. When I called and asked to visit, she sounded relieved. "I've been having nightmares again," she told me over tea and store-bought cookies, about Pavel's final days, about the things he said. Anna was the same age as me, but grief and poverty had aged her prematurely. Her hands shook as she poured tea, and I noticed the apartment was colder than it should have been, probably saving money on heating bills. "Tell me about those final days," I said gently. He came home different from that last trip to the plant. Not just sick. Pavel had been sick before, nothing serious, but this was different. He kept talking about chambers and laboratories, about things they'd found that shouldn't exist. I thought it was delirium from the fever. Anna disappeared into her bedroom and returned with a small wooden box, similar to my jewelry box. From it, she pulled a photograph that made my breath catch. 13 women standing together at a memorial service, all wearing black, all young, all united in their fresh grief. "This was taken at the state funeral," Anna said. "All the wives, together for the first and last time." I studied the photograph, recognizing my own 26-year-old face in the center of the group. But it was the writing on the back that made my skin crawl. In block letters, someone had circled my face and written, "Keep quiet." "Where did you get this?" I whispered. "It was slipped under my door 2 weeks after Pavel died. I always assumed it was meant for all of us, a reminder to honor our husbands by staying silent." Over the next few days, Anna helped me contact 3 other widows who still lived in Ukraine. What I discovered made me realize the scope of the conspiracy was even larger than I'd imagined. Svetlana, Orlov, Mikhail's widow, had kept a box of her husband's belongings that included technical diagrams she'd never understood. When I showed her Viktor's map, she gasped and pulled out similar sketches from Mikhail's papers, detailed drawings of equipment that looked decades more advanced than anything Soviet science should have produced in 1986. "Mikhail drew these the night before he died," Svetlana told me. "He kept saying they were important, that someone needed to understand what they'd found." I thought it was just the fever making him paranoid. Katya Volkov, no relation, despite the shared surname, had been married to Boris, the youngest member of Viktor's team. At 23, when her husband died, she'd been even more naive than I was. But Boris had managed to tell her something that chilled me to the bone. He said they'd found bodies down there, Katya whispered, glancing around her kitchen, as if we might be overheard. "Not recent bodies, old ones, preserved somehow." He said there were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, arranged in some kind of storage system. The 4th widow I contacted was Oksana Petenko, whose husband Sergei had been Viktor's closest friend on the team. Oksana had remarried years ago and moved to a suburb of Kiev, but she agreed to meet me at a cafe downtown. "I never told my second husband about Sergei's final words," she confided over coffee. "How could I? How do you tell someone that your first husband whispered about the things that shouldn't exist and the experiments that never ended?" But it was what Oksana told me next that connected all the pieces. 3 days before Sergei died, he'd given her a small key and made her promise to hide it somewhere safe. She'd kept it all these years, not knowing what it opened. He said it was for a storage locker in the old industrial district, number 447. He made me memorize the address, but I was too scared to ever go there. That evening, Anna and I drove to the industrial district together. Storage facility 447 was in a converted warehouse that looked like it hadn't been maintained since the Soviet era. The key Oksana had given us opened a metal locker about the size of a small closet. Inside, we found a collection that took my breath away, medical files from each of the 13 dead men, showing tissue samples and blood work that clearly demonstrated they hadn't died from radiation poisoning, photographs of the underground facility that matched Viktor's drawings, and most shocking of all, a folder labeled Project Prometheus Cleanup Protocol, containing official orders signed by someone whose name had been blacked out. The orders were chilling in their clinical precision. All personnel with knowledge of sublevel facilities must be terminated. Cover story: acute radiation exposure. Timeline: 3 to 4 weeks post-exposure to maintain credibility. Families to be monitored indefinitely. At the bottom of the folder was a group photograph of our husbands, taken underground in what looked like some kind of laboratory. They were standing next to equipment I didn't recognize, wearing protective suits that were clearly not standard radiation gear. Mikhail was pointing at something off camera, his face showing excitement rather than fear. On the back of the photograph, someone had written the date 3 days before the reactor explosion, and a single, chilling sentence. Last known images of Prometheus Team Alpha before containment failure. Anna gripped my arm as we read those words. Elena, she whispered, I don't think our husbands were killed to cover up what they found. I think they were killed because they caused it. As we drove home in silence, I realized that our quiet investigation had just become something much more dangerous. We weren't just uncovering a decades-old cover-up anymore. We were gathering evidence that could implicate our own husbands in triggering the worst nuclear disaster in history. And somewhere in Moscow, the men who'd survived that disaster were probably already planning how to silence us. The medical files from Sergei's storage locker haunted me for days. I'm not a doctor, but even I could see that the tissue samples and blood work didn't match what radiation poisoning should look like. I needed someone with scientific expertise to confirm what I suspected, that our husbands had died from something entirely different. Anna suggested Dr. Anya Kozlov, a former Soviet nuclear scientist who'd fled to Germany. After the fall of the USSR, she'd published papers questioning the official Chernobyl narrative and had been quietly gathering testimonies from survivors for years. Getting her attention required sending copies of Viktor's journal and the medical files through an encrypted email service that took me 3 attempts to figure out. Dr. Kozlov's response came within hours. Meet me in Prague. Come alone. Bring everything. 2 weeks later, I sat across from a woman who looked nothing like the stern Soviet scientist I'd imagined. Dr. Kozlov was in her 70s, with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a simple bun. But when she spread Viktor's medical files across the cafe table, her expression became deadly serious. Elena, these tissue samples show something I've never seen in radiation victims, she said, adjusting her reading glasses. Look at these cellular structures. She pointed to microscopic photographs that meant nothing to me. Radiation damage is chaotic. It destroys cells randomly, breaks down DNA, causes massive organ failure. But these samples show systematic alteration. The cellular structure has been modified, enhanced, in some areas, enhanced. How? See these metallic deposits. They're not naturally occurring. Someone introduced foreign compounds into your husband's system, compounds that integrated with his cellular structure at a molecular level. This isn't radiation poisoning, Elena. This is something far more sophisticated. Dr. Kozlov pulled out a tablet and showed me comparison images. I've seen similar cellular modifications in classified Soviet biological weapons research from the 1960s. There were rumors of experiments combining human tissue with synthetic compounds to create enhanced resistance to radiation, extreme temperatures, even aging. My coffee went cold as she continued. The problem with those experiments was that the human body eventually rejected the modifications. The subjects would appear enhanced for weeks or months, then rapidly deteriorate as their immune systems attacked their own modified cells. Death was inevitable, but it could be controlled, timed to occur within a specific window. You're saying someone did this to them deliberately. I'm saying your husband and his teammates were exposed to biological agents that had been in development for decades. The question is whether they knew what they were being exposed to. Dr. Kozlov leaned forward, lowering her voice. Elena, I need to tell you something that could put both of us in danger. I've been researching Soviet-era biological weapons programs for 20 years. Project Prometheus wasn't just a code name, it was one of the most classified research initiatives in Soviet history. She pulled out a folder containing documents I couldn't read. They were in Russian, but heavily redacted. Prometheus was designed to create human subjects capable of surviving in extreme environments. The goal was to develop soldiers who could operate in radioactive zones, underwater, in space, anywhere. Normal humans couldn't survive. And you think they were testing this underground at Chernobyl? I think Chernobyl was the perfect cover for continuing experiments that should have ended in the 1960s. Remote location, high security, legitimate reason for radiation exposure. Your husband's team probably discovered evidence of ongoing human experimentation. Dr. Kozlov's tablet showed satellite images of the Chernobyl site, enhanced to show underground structures. The facility beneath Reactor 4 predates the power plant by at least 20 years. It was built during Stalin's era, when Soviet science operated without ethical constraints. But why kill Viktor's team if they were just maintenance workers who stumbled onto something? Because they weren't just maintenance workers, Dr. Kozlov interrupted. Look at their backgrounds, Elena. Viktor was a nuclear physicist with expertise in radiation shielding. Pavel specialized in biological containment systems. Mikhail designed underground ventilation for hazardous materials. They weren't randomly assigned to Chernobyl. They were specifically recruited because their skills were needed for something. The implication hit me like a physical blow. You think they were brought there to work on Prometheus? I think they were brought there to shut it down. The Soviet Union was collapsing, international oversight was increasing, and continuing illegal human experiments was becoming too risky. But when they opened those containment chambers to begin the cleanup, something went wrong. Dr. Kozlov showed me the tissue analysis report again. These modifications in their cellular structure, they're consistent with exposure to weaponized biological agents. Your husbands didn't just discover Project Prometheus, Elena. They were contaminated by it, and the reactor explosion. Emergency sterilization protocol. When containment failed and the biological agents started spreading, someone made the decision to destroy the entire facility with a reactor overload. The radiation would cover up the biological contamination, and the reactor explosion would provide a believable explanation for why 13 highly skilled scientists died so quickly. The cafe around us seemed to fade away as I processed what Dr. Kozlov was telling me. Viktor and his team hadn't been heroes who died containing a nuclear disaster. They'd been victims of a cover-up so massive it required destroying an entire region to hide the evidence. Dr. Kozlov, if this is true, if there really were biological weapons experiments at Chernobyl, then the radiation story ... is the greatest lie ever told, she finished. And Elena, if we're right about this, then there are people at the highest levels of multiple governments who will do anything to keep this secret buried. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You need to understand what you're up against. The Soviet Union may be gone, but the people who authorized Project Prometheus are still alive, still powerful, still protecting their legacy. As I flew back to Kiev that evening, I realized that Dr. Kozlov had given me something more valuable than scientific validation. She'd given me the framework to understand what Viktor had tried to tell me with his dying breath. The truth about Chernobyl wasn't just about nuclear safety or government incompetence. It was about human experimentation on a scale that made Nazi medical experiments look primitive by comparison. And 38 years later, the people responsible were still walking free. 3 days after returning from Prague, I made a decision that Anna called absolutely insane. I was going to crash Viktor's team reunion, uninvited and armed with enough evidence to force a confrontation with the men who'd been lying about my husband's death for 38 years. The memorial gathering was being held at an upscale hotel in Moscow, the kind of place that survived on oligarch money and government contracts. I took the overnight train from Kiev, carrying nothing but a small purse containing the most damning pieces of evidence and a digital recording device. Anna had helped me purchase from a shop that specialized in security equipment. The device was smaller than a matchbox and could record for 12 hours. I activated it before entering the hotel lobby, then slipped it into the decorative flower arrangement near the private dining room, where Viktor's surviving teammates were, holding their annual celebration of lies. Finding them wasn't difficult. 5 men in expensive suits, all in their 60s now, sitting around a table laden with premium vodka and caviar. Success had been kind to them. Dmitri looked particularly prosperous in his tailored jacket and gold watch. They were laughing at something when I walked in. The laughter died immediately. Elena, Dmitri recovered first, though I could see the shock in his eyes. This is ... unexpected. I wasn't invited, I said, pulling out the chair at the head of their table and sitting down uninvited. Curious oversight, don't you think? After all, I was married to one of your fallen heroes. The other 4 men exchanged glances. I recognized from their midnight kitchen meetings 38 years ago. Boris Yakovich, now a successful engineering consultant. Gregory Volhin, who'd parlayed his Chernobyl experience into a lucrative speaking career. Alexei Smirnov and Igor Kovalev, both of whom had done well in the post-Soviet economy. Elena, you shouldn't be here, Alexei said nervously. This is a private memorial for those of us who were actually there. Oh, but I was there, I replied sweetly. I was there when Viktor came home dying from something that wasn't radiation poisoning. I was there when he told me about Project Prometheus. I was there when he made me promise to tell the truth if anything happened to him. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Dmitri's hand tightened around his vodka glass, and I noticed Boris had gone completely pale. Viktor was delirious, Dmitri said carefully. Radiation does terrible things to the mind, makes people imagine underground laboratories, I interrupted, pulling out Viktor's map and spreading it on the table. Makes them imagine biological weapons research. Makes them imagine systematic human experimentation dating back to the 1950s. Gregory leaned forward to study the map, and I saw recognition flicker across his face. Where did you get this? From my husband's journal. The one he kept hidden because he knew you'd kill him for documenting what you found down there. Elena, you're talking nonsense, Boris said, but his voice shook. We were cleanup crew. We contained a reactor explosion. That's all. Then explain these. I placed Dr. Kozlov's tissue analysis reports on the table. Explain why Viktor's medical records show cellular modifications consistent with biological weapons exposure. Explain why none of your dosimeter readings match the radiation levels that would be required to kill 13 healthy men in 3 weeks. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear traffic from the street below. Finally, Igor spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Elena, even if what you're suggesting were true, and I'm not saying it is, do you have any idea what kind of forces you'd be challenging? The people who authorize Project Prometheus aren't just government officials. They're international powers who've built entire careers on the foundation of the Chernobyl narrative. So you admit there was a Project Prometheus. Another silence. Then Dmitri sighed heavily and refilled his vodka glass. Elena, you were always too smart for your own good. Viktor said that about you constantly. Said it would get you in trouble someday. Is that what this is? Trouble. This is a woman who's spent 38 years building elaborate fantasies to avoid accepting that her husband died a hero. Alexei said, but there was no conviction in his voice. I pulled out the final piece of evidence, the photograph from Sergei's storage locker showing their team underground in the Prometheus facility. I placed it in the center of the table and watched their faces. Gregory actually gasped. Boris knocked over his vodka glass. Igor's hands started trembling so badly he had to clasp them together. Where did you get this? Dmitri whispered. Sergei left it for his wife, along with medical files proving that all 13 men were murdered to cover up what they'd discovered, along with official termination orders signed by someone whose name was conveniently blacked out. I stood up and looked down at the 5 men who'd built comfortable lives on the foundation of my husband's death. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going public with this story. I have evidence, I have scientific analysis, and I have witnesses. You can either help me tell the truth about what really happened at Chernobyl, or you can keep lying and face the consequences when the international media gets hold of this. Elena, you don't understand what I understand perfectly. I cut Dmitri off. I understand that you've spent 38 years living off blood money. I understand that 13 good men died because they refused to be part of a cover-up. That makes Nazi war crimes look tame by comparison. And I understand that you 5 survived because you agreed to keep your mouth shut. I gathered my evidence and headed for the door, then turned back for one final statement. Viktor died believing you were his friends. He died trusting that you'd take care of me if anything happened to him. Instead, you erased him from history and left his widow to grieve a lie. Elena, wait. Boris called after me. You can't just watch me, I said, and walked out. But as I reached the hotel lobby, I heard Dmitri's voice, carrying from the dining room, speaking to someone on his phone. We have a problem, a big one. She knows everything. And that's when I realized that my confrontation with Viktor's surviving teammates had just painted a target on my back. The phone call from Dmitri's hotel room followed me back to Kiev like a death sentence. Knew I had perhaps days, maybe hours, before whoever he'd contacted decided I was too dangerous to leave alive. But I also knew that going underground now would mean Viktor's truth died with me. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Kozlov had given me the contact information for Yuri Mark, a former KGB archivist who'd been quietly documenting Soviet-era cover-ups since the 1990s. If anyone has access to the classified files on Prometheus, she'd told me, it would be Yuri. Yuri agreed to meet me at a small Orthodox church on the outskirts of Kiev neutral ground where surveillance would be difficult. He was a thin, nervous man in his 50s, who looked like he'd spent too many years living in fear of his own government. Dr. Kozlov says, you have questions about Project Prometheus, he said without preamble as we sat in the last pew. That's a dangerous topic, even now. Dangerous enough that 13 men were murdered to hide it. Yuri's eyes widened. You know about the termination orders. I know my husband and his team were killed to cover up biological weapons experiments. I know the reactor explosion was deliberate. What I don't know is who gave the orders and why they thought it was worth destroying an entire region to hide the evidence. Yuri was quiet for so long, I thought he might refuse to help. Finally, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. What I'm about to show you could get us both killed, he whispered. These documents were supposed to be destroyed in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, but some of us, in the archives, we made copies. We knew that someday, someone would need to know the truth. The envelope contained photocopies of documents so heavily classified that even the agency letterheads had been redacted. But what remained was devastating. The first document was dated 3 days before the Chernobyl explosion. Urgent containment, breach in sublevel facility, biological agents detected in groundwater, immediate sterilization protocol required. The second was a response from Moscow, Prometheus facility to be sealed, using reactor overload, cover story, safety test malfunction, all personnel with knowledge of sublevels to be terminated post-incident. But it was the third document that made my hands shake. A partially destroyed report with Viktor's name clearly visible. Engineer Volkov has documented unauthorized excavation in sublevel 7, biological containment compromised, estimate 72 hours, until surface contamination becomes uncontainable. Yuri, I whispered, this document is saying that Viktor and his team caused the containment breach. Not caused, Yuri corrected. Discovered. They were brought in as specialists to assess structural damage to the underground facility. What they found was that the biological containment systems had been failing for years, maybe decades. The weaponized organisms were already spreading into the groundwater. He pointed to a line I'd missed. Sublevel contamination predates current incident by estimated 8 to 4 months. The Prometheus experiments had been leaking biological agents into the environment for almost 2 years before your husband's team was brought in. They weren't there to work on the project, they were there to clean it up. Then why were they killed? Because they refused to sign off on a cover-up that would have blamed the contamination on natural seepage from the reactor cooling systems. Your husband's team was supposed to write a report saying the biological agents were a harmless byproduct of normal reactor operations. Yuri showed me another fragment, this one with Dmitri's signature clearly visible. Team leader Petrov confirms compliance with cover story. Remaining personnel to be brought into compliance, are terminated as necessary. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Dmitri had agreed to the cover-up from the beginning. The other 4 survivors had been convinced or coerced into going along. But Viktor and his 12 teammates had refused, choosing death over dishonor. There's more, Yuri said grimly. The reactor explosion wasn't just designed to sterilize the underground facility. It was designed to create a radiation exclusion zone that would prevent anyone from investigating the site for decades. He pulled out a map showing projected radiation contamination patterns. The fallout was carefully calculated to make the entire area uninhabitable for at least 50 years. By the time radiation levels dropped enough to allow detailed investigation, everyone with knowledge of Project Prometheus would be dead from old age. But people still live in the exclusion zone, I protested. There are tours. Researchers carefully controlled access to carefully selected areas, Yuri explained. The sublevel facility is directly beneath the reactor sarcophagus. No one gets close enough to discover the entrance tunnels. I studied the documents again, trying to process the magnitude of what I was learning. Yuri, how many people knew about this? How far up did the authorization go? The termination orders were signed by someone with authority over both nuclear and biological weapons programs. In 1986, that meant Politburo level, possibly higher, and the Americans, the international community. Yuri's expression darkened. Elena, why do you think international aid for Chernobyl cleanup came so quickly and with so few questions asked? Why do you think Western scientists accepted the reactor malfunction story without demanding independent investigation? The implication hit me like a physical blow. They knew. Some of them knew. The biological weapons research that created Project Prometheus wasn't exclusively Soviet. There were collaborative efforts during the Cold War. Unofficial exchanges of research data, shared funding for certain projects. You're saying the cover-up was international. I'm saying that revealing the truth about Project Prometheus wouldn't just embarrass Russia. It would implicate scientists and officials in multiple Western countries who participated in or funded illegal human experimentation. As I left the church that evening, carrying photocopies of documents that could reshape world history, I realized that my quest for justice for Viktor had uncovered something far bigger than a Soviet-era cover-up. I was now in possession of evidence that could bring down government officials and scientific institutions across multiple countries, which meant that the people trying to silence me weren't just Russian oligarchs protecting Soviet-era secrets. They were an international conspiracy, with unlimited resources and absolutely no qualms about making inconvenient widows disappear. Revelations haunted me for days, but they also gave me the framework to understand what Viktor had really discovered beneath Reactor 4. The classified documents proved that Project Prometheus was real, but they didn't explain what the facility actually was or why it required such extreme measures to hide. The answer came from an unexpected source. 3 days after my meeting with Yuri, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single manila envelope containing construction blueprints and a note. Your husband died protecting this truth. Now it's your responsibility. A friend who remembers. The blueprints were unlike anything I'd ever seen. They showed a massive underground complex spreading beneath the entire Chernobyl site like the root system of some enormous tree. But these weren't the rough sketches Viktor had drawn in his journal. These were professional architectural plans, complete with structural specifications and engineering details. That the facility predated the nuclear power plant by at least 20 years. Construction had begun in 1954, during Stalin's final years, when Soviet science operated without ethical constraints or international oversight. The complex consisted of 12 levels, each one deeper and more specialized than the last. The upper levels were relatively mundane storage areas, administrative offices, basic laboratories. But as the blueprints went deeper, the purpose became increasingly sinister. Level 7 was marked as biological containment class for specimens. Level 9 was labeled Enhancement Testing Human Subjects, and at the very bottom, Level 12 was simply marked Genesis Project Authorized Personnel Only. What chilled me most were the detailed specifications for the containment systems. The facility had been designed to house and study biological agents, so dangerous that the entire complex could be sealed and flooded with sterilizing gas in less than 10 minutes. Emergency protocols included surface sterilization, options that could eliminate all life within a 5-kilometer radius. According to the blueprints, Viktor's team had been working in Level 6, assessing structural damage to the primary containment barriers, but their excavation had breached a wall that led directly into Level 7, the biological containment area that had been experiencing minor seepage for almost 2 years. The detailed notes on the blueprints told a story that made my blood run cold. Project Prometheus wasn't just about creating enhanced soldiers. It was about creating entirely new forms of human life. The Genesis project on Level 12 had been attempting to combine human genetic material with synthetic compounds to create beings that could survive in environments that would kill normal humans. The specimens Viktor's team had found weren't experimental subjects. They were the successful results of decades of illegal human experimentation. But the project had a fatal flaw. The enhanced beings were unstable. They required constant medical intervention to prevent their modified cellular structure from breaking down. When the Soviet Union began collapsing and funding for the project dried up, the specimens were placed in suspended animation while scientists searched for a permanent solution. That's when the containment failures began. The suspended animation systems required precise environmental controls. As maintenance was deferred and equipment aged, the biological agents that kept the specimens stable began leaking into the surrounding rock and groundwater. By 1984, according to the blueprint annotations, the contamination had spread far enough to threaten the surface facilities. The nuclear power plant workers were reporting mysterious illnesses. Livestock in nearby farms were showing genetic abnormalities. Children in Pripyat were being born with conditions that had no medical explanation. The Soviet government faced an impossible choice: admit to decades of illegal human experimentation that violated every international treaty, or find a way to sterilize the entire area while providing a believable cover story. The reactor explosion solved both problems. The radiation would kill any remaining specimens and destroy the biological agents, while the nuclear disaster would provide perfect justification for evacuating the entire region. Viktor's team hadn't just discovered evidence of Project Prometheus, they'd walked into the final phase of its termination. The enhanced beings they'd found in Level 7 were the last survivors of decades of experimentation, kept alive in their containment chambers while scientists debated whether to study them further or destroy them entirely. When Viktor and his colleagues refused to sign off on the cover-up, when they insisted on documenting what they'd really found, they sealed their own fate. 13 men with the expertise to understand what they'd discovered, with the moral courage to refuse participation in the cover-up, had to be eliminated before they could expose the truth. But Viktor had been clever. Even as he lay dying, he'd made sure that someone would eventually piece together the real story. His journal, his maps, his careful documentation of evidence, all of it designed to guide me to this moment of understanding. Looking at those blueprints spread across my kitchen table, I finally understood what Viktor had whispered with his dying breath. Below didn't just refer to the underground facility, it referred to the depths of human depravity that Project Prometheus represented. For 50 years, scientists working in the depths beneath Chernobyl had been treating human beings like laboratory animals, experimenting on them, modifying them, creating new forms of life without their consent or knowledge. The reactor explosion had been designed not just to hide the evidence, but to destroy it so completely that no one would ever know how far Soviet science had fallen into barbarity. But they'd underestimated the power of a widow's grief and a dying man's determination to expose the truth. 38 years later, their carefully constructed cover story was finally beginning to crumble. And somewhere in Moscow, London, and Washington, very powerful people were realizing that Elena Volkov had become the greatest threat to their legacy they'd ever faced. 2 weeks after receiving the facility blueprints, I got a call that changed everything. It was from Natasha Kovalenko, the daughter of Leonid Kovalenko, one of Viktor's teammates who'd died in the same wave of radiation poisoning. Mrs. Volkov, Natasha's voice was shaky, emotional. My father wasn't part of the original 13 who died. He was support crew, maintenance level. He survived the initial incident, but he died 6 months ago. Before he passed, he made me promise to contact you if I ever heard that you were asking questions about Chernobyl. My heart raced. Another survivor meant another potential witness, another piece of the puzzle. Natasha, I need to meet with you. Your father may have information that he left you something, she interrupted. A recording he made it when he learned he was dying, said it was his confession for sins he'd carried for 38 years. He said if Elena Volkov ever came looking for the truth about Viktor, I should give it to her. We met the next day at a small cafe in downtown Kiev. Natasha was in her 40s, a librarian with kind eyes that reminded me painfully of Viktor's. She handed me a small audio cassette tape and an old portable recorder. He recorded this 3 days before he died, she said. I've never listened to it. He said it contained things that could get our family killed, but that you had the right to know what really happened to your husband. My hands trembled as I inserted the cassette. Leonid's voice, weak from his final illness but still clear, filled the small space between us. Elena, if you're hearing this, it means you've been asking the right questions about what happened at Chernobyl. I'm sorry it took me 38 years to find the courage to tell you the truth. Viktor was a good man, a brave man, and he died because he refused to be part of something that still gives me nightmares. I wasn't part of the engineering team that found the underground facility. I was maintenance crew, brought in after the discovery to help with cleanup. But I saw things, Elena, things that shouldn't exist in any sane world. The enhanced beings your husband's team found in Level 7 weren't dead when we found them. They were alive, conscious, and they could speak. They'd been human once, volunteers, they claimed, from the 1960s who'd agreed to enhancement procedures in exchange for their families being cared for by the state. But the procedures had changed them into something that wasn't quite human anymore. They could survive in radiation levels that would kill a normal person instantly. They didn't age the way we do, and they had abilities, telepathic abilities that let them communicate without speaking. Viktor spent 3 days interviewing them before the termination order came down. He documented everything, their stories, their origins, the details of what had been done to them. They told him about others like them in facilities across the Soviet Union, about American scientists who'd participated in the research, about experiments that made the Nazi doctors look like amateurs. The beings knew they were going to die. The containment failure meant their life support systems would shut down within days. But they made Viktor promise to tell their story, to let the world know that they'd once been human beings with names, and families, and dreams. Viktor came to me the night before the reactor explosion. He was carrying a metal case containing everything he'd recorded: audio tapes, photographs, medical data, testimony from the enhanced beings themselves. He said if anything happened to him, I should make sure you got the case. But I was a coward. Elena, when Viktor died, when Dmitri and the others made it clear that anyone who spoke out would join Viktor in the ground, I hid the case and kept my mouth shut. I told myself I was protecting my family, but the truth is, I was protecting myself. For 38 years, I've lived with the knowledge that 13 good men died because they refused to participate in covering up crimes against humanity. I've watched Dmitri and his cronies build careers on the blood of enhanced beings who just wanted to be remembered as human. The case is hidden in my basement, behind the furnace in a waterproof container. Inside, you'll find Viktor's original recordings of the enhanced beings' testimony. You'll hear their voices, Elena. You'll hear them describe decades of experimentation, torture disguised as medical research, the creation of beings who were neither fully human nor entirely artificial. But more importantly, you'll hear Viktor's promise to them. He swore that someday someone would tell their story. He swore that their sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten, that the world would know what Project Prometheus really was. I'm dying now, and I can't carry this burden anymore. Viktor kept his promise by documenting their stories. Now it's your turn to keep his promise by making sure those stories are heard. The enhanced beings had names, Elena. They had memories of their human lives, and they died believing that Viktor would make sure the world remembered them not as monsters or experiments, but as people who'd been used and discarded by governments that saw them as tools rather than human beings. Tell their story, Elena. Tell Viktor's story, and forgive an old coward who waited too long to do the right thing. The recording ended with the sound of Leonid's labored breathing, then silence. Natasha and I sat in that cafe for a long time, both of us crying for different reasons. Did you know? I asked her, finally. Did you know what your father had been carrying all these years? I knew he had nightmares, she said quietly. I knew he drank too much and couldn't sleep without medication. I knew he refused to talk about Chernobyl, even when the government started giving medals to clean up veterans. But I never imagined, Natasha, I need to get that case. Can you help me? She nodded, wiping her eyes. Mrs. Volkov, there's something else. Before my father died, he made me promise that if I ever gave you this recording, I should also tell you to be very careful. He said the people who killed Viktor's team are still alive, still powerful, and they'll do anything to keep this secret. Buried that evening, Natasha and I retrieved the metal case from her father's basement. Inside were treasures beyond my wildest imagination. Hours of audio recordings featuring Viktor's voice interviewing the enhanced beings, photographs of the underground facility that matched the blueprints I'd received, and most incredibly, medical documentation showing exactly what had been done to transform human volunteers into something else entirely. But it was the final recording that broke my heart. Viktor's voice, recorded just hours before his death. Elena, my love, if you're hearing this, then you've found the courage I couldn't find. These beings trusted me with their stories, and I'm trusting you with their memory. They were people once. They had names and hopes and families, and they died believing that someone would remember them as human. Don't let their deaths be meaningless. Don't let Project Prometheus remain buried beneath the lies of Chernobyl. The world needs to know what was done in the name of science, in the name of progress, in the name of creating better soldiers for wars that should never have been fought. I love you, Elena. Take care of our child if we have one. And remember, truth is the only memorial these beings will ever have. Listening to Viktor's final message, holding the evidence he'd died to preserve, I finally understood the full weight of what he'd asked me to do. This wasn't just about exposing a government cover-up anymore. This was about giving voice to victims who'd been silenced for decades, about honoring the humanity of beings who'd been treated as disposable experiments, about ensuring that Viktor's final promise to dying souls wouldn't be broken. The enhanced beings of Project Prometheus were going to tell their story through me, and after 38 years of silence, the world was finally going to learn what it really meant to be human. The surveillance began 3 days after I retrieved Leonid's recordings. At first, I thought I was being paranoid. A black sedan parked too long across from my apartment building. The same man in a gray coat appearing at the market when I went shopping. Phone calls that disconnected the moment I answered. But paranoia turned to certainty when I found the photographs. They were slipped under my door on a Tuesday morning while I was having coffee and listening to Victor's recordings of the enhanced beings. The envelope was unmarked, but inside were a dozen surveillance photos of my daily routine: me leaving my apartment, walking to the market, meeting with Anna at the cafe, even sitting in the Orthodox church where I'd met with Yuri. Each photograph was time-stamped and location marked with professional precision. Someone with significant resources had been tracking my movements for weeks, documenting every meeting, every contact, every moment of my investigation. But it was the note attached to the final photograph that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Volkov, your husband's curiosity proved fatal. We suggest you avoid making the same mistake. Some secrets are worth more than one widow's quest for truth. You have 48 hours to cease your activities and destroy all materials related to Project Prometheus. Continued interference will result in consequences you will not survive. The final photograph showed me entering Natasha's building the night we'd retrieved Leonid's case, which meant they knew exactly what I'd found. I called Anna immediately. Pack a bag, I told her. Don't go home tonight. They know everything. Elena, what are you talking about? The people who killed Viktor. They're watching me. They know about the recordings, about the evidence. It's not safe anymore. Anna arrived at my apartment within an hour, and together we made a decision that probably saved both our lives. Instead of hiding, instead of backing down, we were going to make our investigation public immediately. If something happened to us, at least the truth would survive. But first, we needed to protect the evidence. Over the next 6 hours, we made multiple copies of everything: Viktor's journal, the facility blueprints, Leonid's recordings, the medical files, the classified documents from Yuri. We uploaded digital copies to cloud storage accounts in different countries, mailed physical copies to addresses in Prague, London, and New York, and left sealed packages with 3 different lawyers who had instructions to open them if anything happened to us. The surveillance became more obvious as the day progressed. The black sedan was replaced by a white van that didn't even bother hiding. When Anna went to the market for supplies, 2 men in business suits followed her inside and made no attempt to shop, they just watched. That evening, my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Petrenko, knocked on my door, clearly agitated. Elena dear, there have been men asking questions about you, she whispered, glancing nervously down the hallway. Official-looking men with identification. They wanted to know about your visitors, your schedule, whether you'd been behaving strangely. What did you tell them? I told them you were a quiet widow who kept to herself. But Elena... Mrs. Petrenko gripped my arm. These weren't local police. They spoke Russian with Moscow accents, and they had the kind of authority that makes people disappear. That night, Anna and I took turns staying awake. We'd moved all the original evidence to a storage facility across town, but we both knew that wouldn't stop people with the resources to conduct international surveillance operations. 3 a.m., we heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, slow, deliberate steps that stopped directly in front of my door. Then the soft sound of metal against metal, someone testing the locks. Anna grabbed a kitchen knife while I reached for the phone to call police. But before I could dial, the footsteps moved away. A few minutes later, we heard a car start in the parking area below. In the morning, we found that someone had tried to pick my locks but hadn't succeeded. They'd also tampered with my phone line. The connection was dead, cut cleanly where the wire entered the building, but it was what we found taped to my car windshield that confirmed our worst fears. Another photograph, this one showing Anna and me through my apartment window the night before. The angle suggested it had been taken from the building across the street with professional surveillance equipment. The message on the back was brief: final warning. Elena, Anna said, as we stood in the parking lot, both of us trying not to show how frightened we were. I think we need to leave Kiev today. Where can we go that they won't find us? Somewhere public. Somewhere with international media presence. Somewhere they can't make us disappear without causing an international incident. I looked at the surveillance photograph again, at the professional quality of the image, at the expensive equipment that had been used to capture our most private moments. These weren't local thugs or even Russian intelligence services. This was an international operation with unlimited funding and absolutely no qualms about eliminating inconvenient witnesses. But I also thought about Viktor's promise to the enhanced beings. about Leonid's deathbed confession, about 38 years of lies that had buried the truth about crimes against humanity. Anna, I said, making a decision that would change both our lives forever. I know where we need to go, and I know exactly who we need to talk to. Where Prague. Dr. Kozlov said she had contacts in international media. It's time to take this story global. As we packed our few remaining possessions and prepared to flee the only home I'd known since Viktor's death, I realized that my quiet investigation had become something much larger. I was no longer just seeking justice for my husband, was about to expose an international conspiracy that had been hiding crimes against humanity for over half a century. And somewhere in Moscow, London, and Washington, very powerful people were preparing to do whatever it took to stop me. The surveillance photographs had been meant to intimidate me into silence. Instead, they'd convinced me that the truth about Project Prometheus was so devastating that people were willing to kill to protect it, which meant it was exactly the kind of truth the world needed to hear. Prague felt like stepping into a different world. After weeks of surveillance and threats in Kiev, the bustling international atmosphere of the Czech capital offered a sense of safety that I hadn't felt since this all began. Dr. Kozlov met Anna and me at the airport, her expression grim but determined. Elena, bringing this story public will put all of us at risk, she warned as we rode in a taxi through the historic city center. But staying silent means Viktor's truth dies with us. She'd arranged for us to meet with Marcus Weber, an investigative journalist who'd spent 15 years documenting Cold War human rights violations. His office was in a converted monastery near Prague Castle, surrounded by medieval walls that seemed appropriate for the kind of historical secrets we were about to expose. Weber was younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with the intense focus of someone who'd made a career of uncovering uncomfortable truths. His office walls were covered with photographs and documents from dozens of investigations: Nazi war crimes, Soviet gulags, CIA mind control experiments. Dr. Kozlov has briefed me on your situation, he said without preamble. She's also shown me some of the evidence you've collected. If even half of what you're claiming is true, this story will reshape how the world understands the Cold War. I placed Leonid's metal case on his desk and began laying out the evidence piece by piece. Viktor's journal, the facility blueprints, the classified documents from Yuri, the audio recordings of Viktor interviewing the enhanced beings. Weber's expression grew increasingly serious as he examined each item. But it was when I played the recording of Viktor's final message that he stopped taking notes and just listened. Elena, he said when the recording ended, this isn't just a story about Soviet biological weapons research. If your evidence is authentic, this could implicate scientific institutions and government officials across multiple Western countries. What do you mean? Weber pulled out a thick folder from his filing cabinet. I've been researching Cold War biological weapons programs for years. The official narrative is that the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention ended all such research, but classified documents released through Freedom of Information requests tell a different story. He showed me decoded diplomatic cables between Soviet and American officials from the 1960s and 1970s. The language was careful, euphemistic, but the implications were clear. There had been unofficial cooperation between East and West on certain medical research initiatives. Project Prometheus wasn't exclusively Soviet, Weber explained. Based on these communications, it appears to have been part of a joint research program involving scientists from at least 4 countries: Soviet Union, United States, Britain, and France. One cable, dated 1967, made my stomach turn. American technical advisors continue to provide valuable input on enhancement protocols. British funding for specimen acquisition remains reliable. French liaison reports successful replication of Moscow procedures in Masaya facility. Weber, are you saying there were other facilities like the one beneath Chernobyl? I'm saying Chernobyl was probably the largest and most advanced, but it wasn't unique. There are references to similar research installations in Nevada, Scotland, and southern France, all of them officially shut down in the early 1970s. But actually, based on budget allocations I've tracked through declassified financial records, funding for these programs continued well into the 1980s. The research just became more compartmentalized, more deeply classified. Weber showed me a diplomatic cable that made the international scope of the cover-up clear. Termination of Prometheus alpha sites, achieved through nuclear sterilization. All participating governments agree to maintain reactor malfunction narrative. Specimen disposal protocols, successful. No further investigation warranted. The cable was dated 3 days after the Chernobyl explosion and bore the code. Signatures of officials from 4 different intelligence agencies. Elena, this document suggests that the decision to destroy the Chernobyl facility was made jointly by an international committee. The reactor explosion wasn't just a Soviet cover-up, it was a coordinated international operation. But why? Why would Western governments participate in covering up Soviet human experimentation? Because it wasn't just Soviet, Weber said grimly. The enhanced beings your husband interviewed weren't exclusively Russian subjects. According to these financial records, volunteer specimens were sourced from multiple countries through various covert programs. He pulled out a document that made my hands shake, a transport manifest from 1963, listing medical research subjects being moved from facilities in Nevada and Scotland to Prometheus Alpha site. Ukrainian S. Weber, you're telling me that American and British citizens were shipped to Chernobyl for human experimentation. I'm telling you that the enhanced beings Viktor documented included subjects from multiple nationalities, which means that when those beings told Viktor their stories, they weren't just exposing Soviet crimes, they were exposing an international program that treated human beings as expendable research materials. The implications crashed over me like a wave. Viktor hadn't just discovered a Soviet weapons program, he'd uncovered evidence of international collaboration in crimes against humanity that continued for decades after such research was supposedly banned. This explains the surveillance, Anna said quietly. This explains why they're so desperate to silence Elena. If this story breaks, it won't just embarrass Russia, it will implicate serving officials in multiple Western governments. Weber finished. People who are still alive, still in positions of power, still protecting their legacy. Weber leaned back in his chair, studying the evidence spread across his desk. Elena, I need you to understand what you're up against. The people trying to silence you aren't just protecting Soviet-era secrets. They're protecting an international conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of multiple governments. So what do? We publish simultaneously in multiple countries before they can stop us. I have contacts at major newspapers in London, New York, Paris, and Berlin. If we coordinate the release carefully, they won't be able to suppress the story in all jurisdictions at once. That evening, as Weber began preparing the international media strategy that would expose Project Prometheus to the world, I sat in my Prague hotel room, listening to Viktor's recordings of the enhanced beings. One more time, their voices carried accents from different countries, Russian, yes, but also American, British, French. They'd been young volunteers in their original lives, recruited with promises that their sacrifice would serve the greater good of humanity. Instead, they'd been transformed into something that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite artificial, then abandoned in underground chambers when their usefulness ended. Viktor had been the first person in decades to treat them as human, beings worthy of having their stories heard. Now it was my turn to make sure those stories reached the world, not just as evidence of Soviet crimes, but as testimony to an international conspiracy that had treated human lives as disposable research materials for over 3 decades. The enhanced beings of Project Prometheus were about to tell their story to the world, and the international conspiracy that had tried to bury them was about to face the consequences of 38 years of lies. Weber worked through the night, coordinating with journalists and editors across 4 time zones. His strategy was brilliant. In its simplicity, simultaneous publication in major newspapers across multiple countries, making it impossible for any single government to suppress the story before it gained international momentum. The key, he explained as we sat in his office at 3 a.m., surrounded by coffee cups and encrypted phones, is to make sure the story breaks everywhere at once. If they shut us down in London, we're still live in New York. If they pressure German editors, we still have Paris. I watched him work. This man who'd made a career of exposing the kinds of secrets that powerful people killed to protect. He moved with the precision of someone who understood that a single mistake could mean death for all of us. Elena, I need you to record a comprehensive statement, he said, handing me a professional microphone. Everything you know, everything Viktor told you, everything you've discovered. This recording will be part of the package we send to editors. What if something happens to me before the story publishes? Then your statement becomes your testimony from beyond the grave. The enhanced beings trusted Viktor to tell their story. Viktor trusted you to preserve that trust. Now you need to trust me to make sure the world hears their voices. The statement took 4 hours to record. I told Viktor's story, the enhanced beings' stories, the truth about Project Prometheus, and the international conspiracy that had covered it up for nearly 4 decades. By the time I finished, my voice was hoarse. But I felt something I hadn't experienced since Viktor Dita, since that I'd fulfilled my promise to him. Weber's media contacts were impressive. Sarah Chen from The Guardian in London, who'd broken major stories about government surveillance programs. David Martinez from The Washington Post, whose investigations into CIA activities had won multiple awards. Marie Dubois from Le Monde in Paris, known for her fearless reporting on European political scandals, and Klaus Richter from Der Spiegel in Berlin, whose work on Nazi war crimes had helped prosecute dozens of cases. Each editor received the same package, copies of all our evidence, my recorded statement, and Weber's comprehensive analysis linking Project Prometheus to ongoing government cover-ups. But Weber had added something extra: backup insurance that chilled me when he explained it. If any of us disappear, if this story gets suppressed through legal channels, if there's any attempt to silence the truth, automated systems will release everything to WikiLeaks, social media platforms, and smaller independent news sites around the world. A dead man's switch. Anna said, exactly. They can threaten us, but they can't stop the truth from coming out. The enhanced beings waited 38 years for their story to be told. They're not waiting any longer. The press release I helped Weber draft was carefully worded but devastating in its implications. New evidence suggests that the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear disaster was used to cover up the termination of an international biological weapons program involving human experimentation conducted jointly by Soviet, American, British, and French scientists. 13 nuclear engineers died attempting to expose evidence of enhanced human subjects created through decades of illegal research. Their widow's 38-year investigation has uncovered classified documents, audio recordings, and facility blueprints proving that the reactor explosion was a deliberate sterilization protocol designed to hide crimes against humanity. Weber scheduled the coordinated release for 6 a.m. London time, 1 a.m. New York time, 7 a.m. Paris time, and 7 a.m. Berlin time. Maximum impact, he explained. Morning news cycles in Europe, prime evening news in America. By the time any government can organize a response, the story will be trending globally. But as publication time approached, the threats escalated. Weber's phone started receiving calls from government officials, requesting meetings to discuss sensitive national security implications. Sarah Chen texted that her editor had received pressure from very high levels to delay publication. Marie Dubois reported that French intelligence services had requested her source materials for national security review. They're panicking, Weber said, but I could see the tension in his face, which means we're over the target. The night before publication, I sat in my Prague hotel room writing what I thought might be my final letter to the world. My name is Elena Volkov. If you are reading this, it means that powerful people have succeeded in silencing me, but they have failed to silence the truth about Project Prometheus. For 38 years, I have carried the burden of my husband Viktor's final words about the real truth behind Chernobyl. Viktor died because he refused to participate in covering up crimes against humanity. He died because he treated enhanced human beings as people worthy of having their stories heard. He died because he believed that truth was more important than the comfortable lies that governments tell to protect their legacy. The enhanced beings of Project Prometheus were once human volunteers who trusted their governments to use their sacrifice for the greater good. Instead, they were transformed into something else entirely, then abandoned when their usefulness ended. They spent decades in underground chambers, forgotten by the world, until Viktor gave them hope that someone would remember their humanity. I am keeping Viktor's promise to them. I am keeping his promise to me. And I am trusting that you will keep the promise I am making to you, that their story will not be forgotten, that their humanity will be honored, and that the people responsible for these crimes will finally face justice. The enhanced beings had names. They had memories of their human lives. They had hopes that someone would tell their story truthfully and completely. Viktor recorded their voices, their testimonies, their final messages to a world that had forgotten them. Listen to their voices, remember their names, honor their humanity, and demand answers from the governments that treated them as disposable experiments rather than human beings deserving of dignity and respect. At 5:59 a.m. London time, Weber sent the final authorization codes to his network of international journalists, the story that would reshape our understanding of the Cold War, expose an international conspiracy spanning decades, and give voice to victims who'd been silenced for 38 years, was about to break simultaneously across 4 continents, Elena Weber said, closing his laptop and looking at me with something that might have been pride. Victor would be proud of you. You've kept his promise. You've honored the enhanced being's trust. And you've given the world a truth it needs to hear. In 60 seconds, the greatest lie of the 20th century was about to be exposed, and somewhere around the world, very powerful people were about to discover that Elena Volkov had become the one witness they couldn't silence. At exactly 6 a.m. London time, the story broke simultaneously across 4 countries. I watched it happen from Weber's office, surrounded by computer screens showing newspaper websites refreshing with headlines that would change history. Chernobyl, cover-up, widow exposes international biological weapons conspiracy. The Guardian, nuclear disaster used to hide human experimentation program. The Washington Post, Les Cobay's, Die Prometheus, 38. Ans de Mensonges Le Monde, in Chernobyl, Das Prometheus Project. Der Spiegel, within minutes, social media exploded. #Prometheus files began trending globally. News networks picked up the story for their morning broadcasts. The coordinated release had worked perfectly by the time government officials in one country could respond. 3 other countries were already running with the story. My phone started ringing at 6:15 a.m. BBC News wanted a live interview. CNN was sending a crew to Prague. France 24 requested an exclusive for their evening broadcast. German television offered to fly me to Berlin for a primetime special. Elena Weber said, monitoring the global response on multiple screens. You need to choose carefully. Your first television appearance will set the tone for everything that follows. I chose BBC World Service because their signal reached every continent. If the enhanced being's story was going to be heard, it needed to reach the entire world simultaneously. The interview was scheduled for noon, Prague time, which would air during morning shows in America and evening news in Asia. As makeup artists prepared me for camera, I held the photograph of Viktor's team underground in the Prometheus facility, the image that had started this entire revelation. The interviewer, James Crawford, was a veteran journalist who'd covered major international stories for 20 years, but even he seemed shaken by the scope of what we were discussing. Mrs. Volkov, he began, as cameras rolled, you're making extraordinary claims about one of the most studied disasters in history. Can you walk our viewers through what led you to challenge the official Chernobyl narrative? I told Viktor's story simply and directly. His deathbed confession about Project Prometheus, my 38 years of investigation, the evidence that proved 13 men had died not from radiation, but from exposure to biological agents during human experimentation that spanned decades. These are very serious allegations, Crawford said. You're claiming that multiple Western governments participated in illegal human experimentation and then conspired to cover it up using a nuclear disaster. I'm not claiming anything, I replied, holding up the photograph. I'm presenting evidence. This image shows my husband and his team in an underground laboratory that predates the nuclear power plant by 20 years. They're standing next to equipment designed for biological research, not nuclear engineering. I played a brief excerpt from Viktor's recording of the enhanced being's testimony. Their voices, speaking in multiple languages, describing their transformation from human volunteers into something else entirely. The interviewer's professional composure cracked slightly. Mrs. Volkov, what you're suggesting, if true, it would represent one of the largest conspiracy cover-ups in modern history. James, the enhanced beings my husband interviewed, had names, they had memories of their human lives before the experimentation began. They told Viktor about facilities in Nevada, Scotland, and France where similar research was conducted. This wasn't just a Soviet program, it was international collaboration in crimes against humanity. The interview continued for 20 minutes, broadcast live to over 200 million viewers worldwide. I showed Viktor's journal entries, explained the facility blueprints, described the classified documents that proved international coordination of the cover-up. But it was when Crawford asked about my personal motivation that I gave the answer that would be quoted in newspapers around the world for 38 years. I've been dismissed as a delusional widow clinging to conspiracy theories, but the enhanced beings trusted my husband to tell their story. Viktor trusted me to preserve that truth. I'm not doing this for myself, I'm doing this because human beings who were used as experimental subjects deserve to be remembered as people, not as classified research materials. Within hours of the broadcast, the global response was overwhelming. Government officials in 4 countries issued statements denying knowledge of Project Prometheus. Scientists who'd worked on Cold War biological weapons programs began coming forward with corroborating testimonies. Human rights organizations demanded international investigations, but the most powerful response came from an unexpected source. Dr. Robert Harrison, a retired American scientist now in his 80s, held a press conference in Washington, D.C. that afternoon. I worked on what we called enhancement protocols at a Nevada facility in the 1960s, he said, his voice shaking with emotion. We were told we were developing methods to help soldiers survive in extreme environments. But what Mrs. Volkov describes, what her husband documented, it matches what I witnessed. We were creating human subjects who could survive exposures that would kill normal people. Dr. Harrison's confirmation opened floodgates. Within 48 hours, 12 other scientists from 3 countries had come forward with similar testimonies. Former government officials admitted to knowledge of special research programs that operated outside normal oversight. The most dramatic moment came when Sarah Chen published leaked documents from the British Ministry of Defence, showing budget allocations for Prometheus Technical Advisory Services continuing until 1987, a full year after Chernobyl. But it was the response from Dmitry Petrov that confirmed everything I'd claimed. Instead of maintaining his heroic Chernobyl narrative, he issued a statement through his lawyer. Mr. Petrov acknowledges that certain classified activities occurred at Chernobyl prior to the reactor incident. However, his participation was limited. 2. Following direct orders from superior authorities. He maintains that he and his colleagues acted in accordance with legitimate government directives and bears no personal responsibility for any outcomes. Dmitry's admission that there had been classified activities at Chernobyl was the final piece of validation I needed. The man who'd called me delusional had just confirmed that Viktor's team had indeed discovered something beyond a simple reactor malfunction. Television networks around the world began running documentaries about Project Prometheus. Families of missing persons from the 1960s and 1970s started coming forward, wondering if their loved ones might have been among the volunteer specimens referenced in the declassified documents. That as I watched the global response unfold from my Prague hotel room, I realized that Viktor's promise to the enhanced beings had been kept in ways he never could have imagined. Their story wasn't just being told, it was reshaping how the world understood the Cold War, human experimentation, and the lengths governments would go to hide their crimes. The enhanced beings of Project Prometheus finally had their voices heard, and 38 years after Viktor's death, the truth he'd died protecting was setting the world free. The counterattack began within hours of my BBC interview. By evening, legal teams from 4 different countries had filed injunctions, attempting to force me to retract my statements and surrender all evidence related to Project Prometheus. The coordinated response proved everything I'd claimed about international conspiracy, but it also showed how far powerful interests would go to silence the truth. The first injunction came from a London court, filed by something called the National Security Heritage Foundation, an organization that didn't exist until 3 days after my interview aired. Their petition claimed that my allegations threatened ongoing intelligence operations and demanded immediate cessation of all media appearances. Similar legal actions followed in Washington, Paris, and Berlin. Each filing used identical language about threats to national security and protection of classified information vital to international stability. The lawyers representing these mysterious organizations wore expensive suits and spoke with the authority of people accustomed to making inconvenient problems disappear. But Weber had anticipated this response. "Elena, they're doing exactly what we expected," he said as we reviewed the legal documents. "These injunctions prove they're panicking. If your story were false, they'd simply debunk it with evidence. Instead, they're trying to silence you through courts." The character assassination campaign was more sophisticated than the legal attacks. Within 48 hours, news outlets began running stories questioning my mental stability. "Grieving Widow's 38-year delusion," read one headline. "Chernobyl conspiracy. When grief creates fantasy," declared another. The articles all followed the same template: interviews with psychiatric experts who'd never met me but were willing to diagnose me as suffering from prolonged grief disorder, and conspiracy ideation. They quoted unnamed former colleagues of Viktor who claimed he'd been unstable in his final weeks, prone to paranoid fantasies about secret government programs. Most damaging were the leaked medical records, obviously fabricated, showing that I'd been treated for depression and anxiety following Viktor's death. The records included falsified prescriptions for antipsychotic medications in session, notes from therapists I'd never met describing my elaborate delusional system centered on governmental persecution fantasies. It's textbook character assassination, Weber explained as we watched the coordinated media attacks unfold. Discredit the messenger when you can't debunk the message. But Elena, look at what they're not doing. What do you mean? They're not producing any evidence that contradicts your claims, no alternative explanations for the facility blueprints, no credible debunking of the medical evidence, no explanation for why classified documents reference Project Prometheus. They're attacking your credibility because they can't attack your evidence. The attacks escalated when government officials began making statements. A spokesperson for the U.S. State Department described my allegations as baseless conspiracy theories that threatened to damage important international relationships built on trust and mutual cooperation. The British Foreign Office issued a statement, calling my claims irresponsible speculation that disrespects the memory of genuine Chernobyl heroes. But the most revealing response came from Moscow. Instead of the outright denials I'd expected, the Russian government issued a carefully worded statement, acknowledging that certain historical research activities at Soviet facilities may not have met contemporary ethical standards, while maintaining that the Chernobyl incident was unrelated to any such activities. The admission that there had been historical research activities that didn't meet ethical standards was exactly the kind of qualified confession that proved guilt while trying to limit liability. Moscow was essentially admitting to human experimentation while denying connection to Chernobyl. The most personal attack came when someone leaked Viktor's death certificate to tabloid newspapers, highlighting the official cause of death as acute radiation syndrome and suggesting this proved my husband had indeed died from reactor exposure rather than biological contamination. But Weber turned this attack into our advantage. Elena, they've just given us another opening, he said, pulling up the leaked death certificate on his computer. Look at the signature on this document. The certificate was signed by Dr. Alexei Komarov, the chief medical officer who'd overseen treatment of all 13 men from Viktor's team. Weber had been investigating Dr. Komarov's background and discovered something remarkable. Komarov wasn't a radiation specialist, Weber explained. His background was in biological weapons research. He'd spent 15 years studying the medical effects of enhanced human subjects before being transferred to Chernobyl in 1985. He wasn't brought in to treat radiation victims. He was brought in to document the deaths of biological weapons test subjects. This revelation led to our most devastating counterattack. Weber arranged for Dr. Kozlov to give a press conference in Berlin, presenting Komarov's complete medical background and questioning why a biological weapons specialist had been the primary doctor treating supposed radiation victims. The medical officer who signed Viktor Volkov's death certificate was an expert in biological contamination, not radiation poisoning, Dr. Kozlov told assembled reporters. His presence at Chernobyl suggests that medical authorities knew from the beginning that they were dealing with something other than nuclear exposure. The press conference also featured Dr. Harrison, the American scientist who'd worked on enhancement protocols in Nevada. He brought declassified medical files showing identical tissue damage patterns between Nevada test subjects and the Chernobyl victims. The cellular modifications Elena Volkov described are consistent with exposure to biological agents I helped develop in the 1960s, Dr. Harrison testified. The medical evidence clearly shows these men died from biological contamination, not radiation poisoning. But the most powerful moment came when Weber revealed the existence of additional audio recordings testimonies from enhanced beings that Viktor had hidden separately from the main collection. These recordings included names, dates, and specific details about the international volunteers who'd participated in the program. One recording featured an enhanced being who identified himself as James Morrison, originally from Manchester, England, who'd volunteered for medical research to help soldiers in 1963. Another was Marie Dubois, sharing a name with our French journalist contact. who'd been a volunteer at the Sorbonne recruited for advanced physiological studies in 1965. The specificity of these testimonies, combined with archival records showing these individuals had indeed disappeared during the time frames mentioned, provided undeniable evidence that Project Prometheus had involved international subjects, just as I'd claimed. As the legal challenges mounted and the character assassination campaign intensified, something unexpected happened. Public opinion began turning in my favor. Social media campaigns supporting my investigation gained millions of followers. Hashtags like #JusticeForVictor and #PrometheusVictims trended globally. Most importantly, families of missing persons from multiple countries began coming forward with evidence that their loved ones might have been among the Project Prometheus subjects. Each new testimony weakened the government denials and strengthened the case for international investigation. The backlash had been designed to silence me and discredit Viktor's truth. Instead, it had drawn global attention to crimes that powerful people had spent decades trying to bury. The enhanced beings of Project Prometheus finally had the world listening to their story, and no amount of legal maneuvering could put that truth back in its underground grave. 3 weeks after my BBC interview, the validation I'd sought for 38 years came from the most unexpected source. The International Committee of the Red Cross announced they were launching a formal investigation into Project Prometheus. Based on the evidence I'd presented, Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, the committee's director of historical investigations, held a press conference in Geneva that changed everything. Standing behind a podium bearing the Red Cross symbol, she addressed the international community with the authority of an organization that had investigated war crimes for over a century. Based on evidence provided by Mrs. Elena Volkov and corroborated by multiple independent sources, the International Committee of the Red Cross has determined that there is sufficient credible evidence to warrant a formal investigation into allegations of systematic human experimentation conducted under the code name Project Prometheus. Dr. Hartman announced, the Red Cross investigation legitimized everything I'd claimed. Within hours, 3 major universities announced they were forming an independent academic consortium to study the historical implications of the Prometheus revelations. The Max Planck Institute in Germany, Cambridge University in England, and MIT in the United States would jointly analyze all available evidence and publish their findings in peer-reviewed journals. But the most significant validation came when the European Parliament passed a resolution calling for full disclosure of all government documents related to Cold War biological research programs, with particular emphasis on activities conducted under the designation Project Prometheus. The resolution passed by a vote of 487 to 23, with the supporting statement reading, "The testimony of Mrs. Elena Volkov and the evidence she has presented raise serious questions about the participation of European governments in programs that may have violated the Nuremberg Code and other international agreements governing human experimentation." The academic investigation began immediately. Dr. Sarah Williams from Cambridge led a team of historians and scientists who traveled to Prague to examine all the evidence firsthand. Their preliminary report, published just 2 weeks later, was devastating to those who'd tried to discredit me. The documentation provided by Mrs. Volkov demonstrates clear evidence of an international biological research program that operated from approximately 1954 to 1986. The medical evidence strongly suggests that the 13 nuclear engineers who died following the Chernobyl incident were not victims of radiation exposure, but rather subjects of biological contamination, consistent with experimental agents described in declassified research documents. The report continued. Particularly compelling is the audio testimony recorded by Viktor Volkov of enhanced human subjects who describe voluntary participation in research programs spanning multiple decades. The specificity of these accounts, combined with archival evidence of missing persons whose profiles match the described subjects, provides strong corroboration for Mrs. Volkov's claims. Dr. Williams presented her team's findings at a packed auditorium at Cambridge University, with the lecture broadcast live across multiple networks. The most powerful moment came when she played excerpts from Viktor's recordings of the enhanced beings, their voices echoing through the historic hall. These voices represent perhaps the only direct testimony from subjects of illegal, human experimentation conducted during the Cold War. Dr. Williams told the audience, They speak not just as evidence of historical crimes, but as human beings, whose dignity and humanity were systematically violated by governments that treated them as disposable research materials. The scientific community's endorsement opened floodgates of additional evidence. Dr. Margaret Chen, a geneticist at MIT, published a paper analyzing tissue samples that Dr. Kozlov had preserved from Viktor's medical files. Her findings confirmed what we'd suspected. The cellular modifications were consistent with exposure to synthetic, biological agents designed to enhance human capabilities. The tissue samples show evidence of systematic, genetic modification using techniques that were theoretically possible in the 1960s, but ethically prohibited under international law. Dr. Chen wrote, "The subjects appear to have been genetically altered to survive in extreme environmental conditions, suggesting a military application for the research. But the most emotionally powerful validation came from families of missing persons who'd been contacted by the academic consortium. James Morrison's sister in Manchester provided DNA samples that matched genetic material found in Viktor's preserved tissue samples. Marie Dubois, niece in Paris, brought forward letters her aunt had written before disappearing, describing exciting opportunities to contribute to medical research that could help soldiers survive in dangerous conditions. These family connections transformed the enhanced beings from abstract research subjects back into real people with names, histories, and loved ones who'd spent decades wondering what had happened to them. Each identification made their humanity more real, their suffering more immediate, and the crimes committed against them more inexcusable. The political impact was swift and dramatic. 3 countries announced they were declassifying additional documents related to Cold War biological research. The American government released files showing budget allocations for international research cooperation that directly corroborated the financial evidence Weber had found. Britain published diplomatic cables confirming technical advisory services provided to Soviet facilities between 1963 and 1975. Most significantly, the Russian government made an unprecedented admission. In a statement issued through their United Nations representative, Moscow acknowledged that certain research activities conducted at Soviet facilities during the Cold War period may have exceeded ethical boundaries established by international agreements and expressed regret for any suffering experienced by voluntary research participants and their families, while carefully worded to avoid legal liability. The statement was the closest thing to an official admission of guilt that any government had provided. More importantly, it validated my 38 years of investigation and honored Viktor's sacrifice in documenting the truth. The surviving members of Viktor's team faced consequences as well. Dmitry Petrov was stripped of his medals and honors by the Russian government, officially for misrepresenting the nature of his service at Chernobyl. The other 4 survivors faced similar sanctions, their comfortable careers as Chernobyl heroes ending in disgrace. But for me, the most meaningful validation came in a letter from Dr. Hartman of the International Red Cross. Mrs. Volkov, your courage in preserving and presenting this evidence has given voice to victims who were silenced for decades. The enhanced beings whose testimony your husband recorded will finally be recognized not as experimental subjects, but as human beings whose dignity was violated and whose sacrifice deserves acknowledgement. Your persistence has ensured that their humanity will be remembered and their suffering will not be forgotten. Sitting in my Prague hotel room, reading those words, I finally felt the weight of 38 years lifting from my shoulders. Viktor's promise to the enhanced beings had been kept, their voices had been heard, their humanity had been acknowledged, and the truth he died protecting had finally set us all free. The girl who'd been dismissed as a delusional widow had become the woman who'd exposed one of the greatest cover-ups in modern history. More importantly, I'd honored the trust that dying souls had placed in my husband, and that my husband had placed in me. 6 months after the International Red Cross launched their investigation, the reckoning I'd dreamed of for 38 years finally arrived. The final report, released simultaneously in Geneva, London, Washington, and Moscow, was more damning than even I had imagined. The international investigation into Project Prometheus ran 847 pages and included testimony from 127 witnesses, analysis of over 3,000 classified documents, and scientific examination of evidence from multiple countries. But it was the executive summary that made headlines around the world. The investigation concludes that Project Prometheus was an international biological weapons research program that conducted systematic human experimentation on at least 400 subjects between 1954 and 1986. The program involved official participation by government agencies from the Soviet Union, United States, United Kingdom, and France. The 1986 Chernobyl nuclear incident was deliberately triggered to destroy evidence of the program and eliminate witnesses who had discovered its existence. Dr. Hartman presented the findings at a press conference that was broadcast live to over 500 million viewers worldwide. Standing beside her were representatives from the academic consortium, human rights organizations, and families of identified Project Prometheus victims. Mrs. Elena Volkov's courage in preserving and presenting evidence of her husband's discoveries has revealed one of the most systematic violations of human rights conducted during the Cold War period, Dr. Hartman announced. The enhanced beings, whose testimony Viktor Volkov recorded, were real people whose humanity was violated by governments that treated them as expendable research materials. The report's most shocking revelation was the scope of the program. Project Prometheus had operated facilities in 12 locations across 4 countries, with the Chernobyl site serving as the primary research center due to its remote location and high-security infrastructure. The enhanced beings Viktor had interviewed weren't the only survivors. The investigation had identified evidence of similar subjects in suspended animation at facilities in Nevada, Scotland, and southern France. All of these sites had been hastily decommissioned in the late 1980s, with their contents either destroyed or transferred to even more classified locations. But it was the financial analysis that proved the international conspiracy beyond any doubt. The investigation traced funding flows, showing that Project Prometheus had received approximately $2.3 billion in combined funding from multiple government sources over 3 decades. American pharmaceutical companies had provided technical expertise, British universities had supplied research staff, French medical institutions had developed containment protocols. The report included a formal finding that the 13 nuclear engineers who died following the Chernobyl incident were murdered to prevent disclosure of Project Prometheus. Their deaths were deliberately caused through exposure to biological agents designed to simulate radiation poisoning, providing cover for the reactor explosion that destroyed evidence of the underground facility. Reading those words, "murdered to prevent disclosure," finally gave me the official validation of what I'd known in my heart for 38 years. Viktor and his teammates hadn't died as heroes containing a nuclear disaster. They'd been murdered as witnesses to crimes against humanity. The political consequences were swift and dramatic. 3 high-ranking officials from the Reagan administration were stripped of their security clearances and faced congressional hearings about their knowledge of American participation in Project Prometheus. 2 retired British intelligence officers lost their knighthoods and faced potential criminal charges. A former French defense minister was arrested on charges of crimes against humanity. But the most satisfying moment came when Dmitry Petrov was formally charged by Russian prosecutors with conspiracy to commit murder and falsification of state records. The man who'd called me delusional, who'd built a comfortable life on the foundation of my husband's death, was finally facing justice for his crimes. The other surviving members of Viktor's team received lesser charges, acknowledging their cooperation with investigators and their expressions of remorse. All of them issued public apologies to the families of their murdered teammates, admitting that they'd participated in the cover-up out of fear for their own lives. Boris Yakovich's statement was particularly moving. Elena Volkov spent years fighting for truth that we were too cowardly to support. We watched her be dismissed as delusional when we knew she was telling the absolute truth. We honored our dead friends with monuments and medals while dishonoring their memory with lies. We can never undo that betrayal, but we can acknowledge it and ask forgiveness from the families we failed. The international community responded with unprecedented cooperation in addressing the historical crimes. The United States established a $500 million fund to compensate families of identified Project Prometheus victims. Britain created a formal commission to investigate all Cold War-era human experimentation programs. France declassified archives dating back to 1950%, revealing additional programs that violated international law. Most meaningfully for me, the Russian government issued a formal apology that specifically acknowledged Viktor's heroism and my persistence in seeking truth. The government of the Russian Federation formally apologizes to Elena Volkov for the dismissive and hostile treatment she received. While seeking justice for her husband Viktor Volkov and his murdered colleagues, Viktor Volkov died as a true hero, not because he contained a nuclear disaster, but because he refused to participate in covering up crimes against humanity. His widow's 38-year quest for truth has revealed historical injustices that demand acknowledgement and accountability. The apology was signed by the current president and delivered personally by the Russian ambassador to Prague, who presented me with Viktor's posthumous Order of Courage, the highest civilian honor for moral bravery. But the most emotional moment of the entire reckoning came when Dr. Hartman presented me with a bound volume containing the complete testimonies of all the enhanced beings Viktor had interviewed. The book was titled Voices from Prometheus, the testimonies of enhanced human subjects, and bore a dedication to Elena Volkov, who kept faith with the dying, and to Viktor Volkov, who gave voice to the voiceless. Their promise has been kept. These voices have been heard. These lives have been remembered. Looking through the volume, seeing the enhanced beings' words preserved in permanent form, I finally felt the weight of my promise to Viktor lifting completely. The dying souls who trusted him to tell their story had been honored. The truth he'd died protecting had been acknowledged. The love that had sustained me through 38 years of doubt and dismissal had been vindicated. The enhanced beings of Project Prometheus finally had their memorial, not a monument of stone, but a testament of truth that would ensure their humanity was never forgotten again. And somewhere, in whatever peace the dead find, Viktor knew that his final promise had been kept by the woman who'd loved him enough to spend a lifetime fighting for his truth. 1 year after the International Red Cross investigation concluded, I returned to Chernobyl for the first time since Viktor's death. The exclusion zone looked different now, not just because of the passage of time, but because I finally understood what had really happened in this place, where my husband died. The memorial ceremony was unlike any Chernobyl remembrance before it. Representatives from 4 countries gathered not to honor the heroes of a nuclear disaster, but to acknowledge the victims of Project Prometheus and the 13 men who died trying to expose the truth. The new memorial stood where Reactor 4's sarcophagus once dominated the landscape, made of black granite polished to mere brightness. It bore the names of all 400 identified Project Prometheus subjects, with Viktor and his 12 teammates honored in a special section titled Those Who Refused to Stay Silent. But it was the inscription I'd written that meant the most to me, in memory of the enhanced beings who trusted Viktor Volkov to tell their story, and of the 13 engineers who died rather than bury the truth. They sacrificed everything so that the world would remember, enhanced or not, experimental subject or witness, in life or in death, we are all human beings deserving of dignity, respect, and the right to have our voices heard. At the base of the memorial, in a waterproof chamber, lay a copy of Viktor's original recordings along with testimonies from families of the identified subjects. Future generations would be able to hear the voices of people who'd been transformed by science but never lost their humanity. Dr. Hartman spoke at the dedication ceremony, her words carrying the weight of institutional acknowledgement that had taken 38 years to achieve. This memorial stands not just as a monument to the dead, but as a promise to the living. Never again will governments be permitted to treat human beings as disposable research materials. Never again will the voices of victims be silenced by the convenience of state secret. The families of the enhanced beings had traveled from around the world to attend the ceremony. James Morrison's sister Margaret read a letter her brother had written before volunteering for the program. I hope my sacrifice will help make soldiers safer and bring wars to quicker ends. Marie Dubois, niece Sophie, brought her aunt's medical journals describing her excitement about contributing to scientific advancement that could save lives. These human details, the hopes, dreams, and noble intentions of people who'd trusted their governments to use their sacrifice responsibly, the crimes committed against them even more heartbreaking. The enhanced beings hadn't been coerced or kidnapped. They'd volunteered to serve humanity and been betrayed by the very institutions they'd trusted. My role had evolved from grief-stricken widow to internationally recognized advocate for government accountability. Universities invited me to speak about the importance of questioning official narratives. Human rights organizations sought my advice on investigating historical families of missing persons contacted me when governments dismissed their concerns as conspiracy theories. The Elena Volkov Foundation, established with funds from the compensation settlement, worked to ensure that other voices silenced by institutional power would be heard. We provided legal support for families seeking truth about disappeared relatives, funded research into government cover-ups, and maintained archives of testimony from victims of state-sponsored crimes. But my most important work remained personal. Every month, I received letters from people around the world who'd been dismissed as delusional or conspiracy theorists when they tried to expose uncomfortable truths. Some were family members of soldiers exposed to experimental weapons. Others were survivors of medical experiments they'd never consented to. All of them had been told they were crazy for insisting that their government had betrayed them. To each of them, I wrote the same message. Your truth matters. Your voice deserves to be heard. Your loved one's sacrifice has meaning. Don't let anyone convince you that seeking justice makes you delusional. I spent 38 years being called crazy for telling the truth about my husband's death. Now that truth has changed how the world understands history. Keep fighting. Keep speaking. Keep believing that truth has power, even when power tries to bury truth. The most meaningful response to the Prometheus revelations came from an unexpected source. The scientific community had established new ethical protocols for all research involving human subjects. The Volkov standards required that any research with potential dual-use applications be subject to international oversight and that all subjects receive complete information about potential risks and long-term consequences. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, now heading an ethics board at MIT, explained the significance. Elena Volkov's investigation revealed how easily scientific research can be perverted when conducted in secrecy without ethical oversight. The enhanced beings trusted scientists to use their sacrifice responsibly. Instead, they were treated as expendable test subjects. The Volkov standards ensure that never happens again. But perhaps the most personal legacy was the relationship I'd developed with the surviving families of Project Prometheus subjects. We'd formed a community of people united, not by shared genetics or geography, but by shared commitment to honoring the memory of loved ones who'd been used and discarded by governments that forgot their humanity. Margaret Morrison, James's sister, had become like family to me. Elena, she told me at the memorial ceremony, you gave my brother back his voice. For 60 years, I wondered what happened to him. Now I know he died believing someone would tell his story. Viktor kept that promise, and you made sure the world heard it. Standing at Viktor's grave after the memorial ceremony, I finally felt the peace that had eluded me for 38 years. The small headstone now bore an updated inscription: Viktor Volkovil, husband, nuclear engineer, and keeper of promises to the voiceless. His truth set us all free. I placed a new photograph at the base of his headstone, the image of the memorial at Chernobyl, with its list of names and its promise that their voices would be remembered. Viktor, I whispered, your promise is kept. The enhanced being's story has been told, their humanity has been honored, and the world will never forget what it really means to be human. As I walked away from the cemetery that evening, I carried with me not the burden of unspoken truth, but the satisfaction of promises fulfilled. Viktor's love had sustained me through 38 years of doubt and dismissal. His truth had given me the strength to challenge the most powerful institutions on earth. His final words to the enhanced beings that someone would remember their humanity had become my life's mission and my greatest achievement. The enhanced beings of Project Prometheus finally had their memorial, their dignity, and their peace. Viktor had his vindication and his honor. And I had the knowledge that love, truth, and persistence can overcome even the most carefully constructed lies. Some secrets are worth a lifetime of being called crazy. Some promises are worth 38 years of fighting to keep, and some truths are so powerful that no conspiracy, no matter how vast or well-funded, can bury them forever. If you've ever been dismissed for speaking an inconvenient truth, remember Elena Volkov. Remember Viktor Volkov. Remember the enhanced beings who trusted them with their final words. And remember that your voice matters, your truth has power, and your refusal to stay silent can change the world.